And we are now going to turn into Jorge's work. Jorge is one of the organizers of this event, so and he promoted the development of this. So a special thanks to you, Jorge, as well. Jorge is a lawyer and an artist who has been interested in the intersection between human rights and the performing arts. And recently he finished his MA in anthropology and dance, where he explored the misappropriation of some movements by non-indigenous people. And within that scenario, he has also discussed how rhythm might help to keep these corporeal knowledges protected. So thank you very much, Jorge, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Francisco. Just give me a second. I'm gonna allow for start sharing the content. So thank you, Francisco, and thanks everyone else for joining this talk. I am having a little bit of a trouble with my app because I'm connecting through my iPad, and I'm not really sure why I cannot show my camera at the moment, but I will be sharing my screen with some slides that I prepared for you. So if you just bear with me for a second, I will be showing this material. Is that visible for everybody? Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna start with the title of this presentation. The topic that I am bringing to you is the role of new technologies to prevent or to fight the cases of misappropriation of indigenous dances. This is a topic that I've been working on for the past year and a half, and so I will be sharing with you some of the reflections that I've been developing. First of all, as an introduction and as an exercise, I would like you to think the two key elements that are going to be very present throughout this presentation. So I want you to portray the notion, the concept, the image of indigenous culture and technology. And what is your sensation, your reaction? Do they seem contradictory? Do they seem as antonyms? What is the first, the reaction that you're getting from this? Because this apparent contradiction is precisely a relationship that I will be trying to attack and to defy over this presentation. In the context of South America and in Ecuadorian culture, where I come from, indigenous culture is always deemed as the roots, as the past, and as the origin. But through this exercise, indigenous cultures are denied the right to portray themselves and to project themselves to the future. And so I think that the distinction between technology and indigenous culture is one that it's not really working for the benefit of indigenous populations, and more than anything is making even deeper the digital divide that we have nowadays. So please help me out with the next slide. And I will be introducing this topic by mentioning that there are a lot of cases of misappropriation of indigenous dances, and to frame this presentation within this event, we can say that dance is one of the many ways in which rhythm is expressed. And so we are going to be focusing on that, on the movements, on the physical movements that are considered as traditional dances. And even though there's a big body of examples, I'm just going to bring a couple of them to you as an introduction, and also so that we can start finding some patterns or some elements that are going to help us to develop the next presentation. Please go ahead, Nai. So in here you can see the Hopi traditional dance, which is called the Ka Matehaka. This raised a big controversy because it was used by the Italian manufacturer of vehicles, Fiat, in one of their commercials without authorization or any agreement. And so this has happened also in the context of the Rugby World Cup. Over and over again, the New Zealand team is performing this dance without the approval or the agreement of traditional wearers. And so this is one of the most important cases that have been happening in the last couple of years, but it was already settled, and the government decided to provide material and immaterial reparations for the community for, yes, misappropriating their culture and their dances in particular. Next slide, please. Now, this example, it's very important to me because this is what triggered the research project that I decided to put together. This is Fortnite, a video game that might be known for a lot of people. And there were 4 different lawsuits against the creators of this video game because of the dances that are included within it. Because if you are playing this game, you can allow your avatar, you can allow your character to dance an array of dances that go from pop culture to traditional and folk dances. And of course, this raises a lot of questions about ownership, about authorship, and how the dances are getting translated into digital environments. And of course, as you can see in this picture, one of the dances that are included in there can be considered as traditional dances. And this is why I decided to come across with this project and think, if new technology is being used to misappropriate indigenous dances or traditional dances, how can we turn the tables? How can we use the same technology to prevent this, and how we can use to fight this situation? Next slide, please. And of course, if I was going to tackle this issue, I needed to know what was the current situation, why the misappropriation of dances was happening. And so this led me to think about the current legal frameworks wherein indigenous dances are embedded, because you cannot raise hypothetical or theoretical suggestions on how new technology can potentially help indigenous populations, but we need to start addressing what are the shortcomings, what are the gaps that the current international frameworks that are regulating the transaction, the exploitation of dances have to say about this. And so in summary, we can say that in this presentation, we are going to tackle briefly the current legal framework where indigenous dances are embedded. Then we are going to explain what is it that I'm considering as new technologies of human movement recognition through an internship period that I did at the Ritmo Center of the University of Oslo. And finally, we're going to merge these 2 elements together as a means to come up with the strategies, because the normative front, the creation of new laws and treaties, that is the most effective way to prevent controversies and disputes. But we cannot wait until the new conventions are created. The last convention of the United Nations Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples took 23 years to be created. And so if we wait another 23 years for a new convention or a new law to be created, we will come across with a lot of more cases of misappropriation. So that is why I thought that technology can assist us in some way until new legal frameworks arise. In the next slide, we're going to see a visual representation of how these elements are colliding together. So law, TCE, which means traditional cultural expressions, or ICH, as is known in the UNESCO type of rhetoric, which means intangible cultural heritage. Technology and the resulting merge is an interdisciplinary approach that we're having here. So the empirical portion of the study that I did for this research, as I told you before, was carried over the Ritmo Center, which is an interdisciplinary research center devoted to study the interconnections between rhythm, time, and motion. And I really needed to go there so that I can clarify what are the actual possibilities, what are the limitations of these new technologies of human movement recognition, if I was going to suggest them as potential solutions for this issue. Next slide, please. So addressing now the legal condition of indigenous dances, we need to acknowledge that these cultural products are embedded in different frameworks and different legal regimes. You want to tackle the issue as part of the intangible cultural heritage of a particular community, but you can also tackle it as from the discourse of the human rights and say that this is an expression of the self-determination or the sustainment of the knowledge systems of traditional cultures. You can also address it and tackle the issue from the United Nations Declarations of the Right of Indigenous Peoples. But the one that I wanted to focus the most was intellectual property regimes. And the reason why I needed to focus on this is because IPR, as the way that I'm gonna say it from now on, IPR are very effective in preventing the usage by third parties. And so by having a strong intellectual property strategy, you can actually prevent other people from using the product of intellect, and also you can gain the total monopoly over a creation. So this is the reason why over the next slide, you're gonna see that I wanted to highlight the three main elements that are present across intellectual property regimes. Of course, national systems and national laws have an impact on the way that traditional dances are protected or not. In some countries, the protection have some requirements that differ slightly from one country to the other, but in general, the three main components that intellectual property regimes are having is authorship, innovation, and fixation. And so for a cultural product as dance to be protected, it has to have an individual author, an identified author. It has to have a certain degree of innovation, and also it has to be fixated over a tangible medium. But if you take for a second the case of indigenous dances, these three values are at odds with the way that indigenous populations create not only their dances, but their knowledge in general, because their knowledge tend to be collectively owned instead of individually held. Also, when it comes to innovation, the notions of innovation that you can find within intellectual property regimes are very narrow. And this is one of the reasons why traditional dances cannot be protected, and therefore they are even more vulnerable for appropriation by third parties. And of course, if we're talking about fixation, this is at odds with the way that traditional peoples transmit their knowledge, which is known to be orally transmitted. And so these three elements are the most salient elements that I wanted to focus on, but I just want to highlight that the way that the laws are addressing indigenous dances has been very convoluted. And through this research, I discovered that only 100 years ago, indigenous dances were prohibited in Canada and United States. And there are very interesting reports that you can find, for example, in the books of Jacqueline Murphy, when she's describing the way that indigenous dances were described by governmental representatives, and indigenous dances were deemed as the backbone of indigenous identity. And so a big strategy to dismantle indigenous identity was to prohibit indigenous dances, because according to governmental perspectives, if you were to blur and assimilate indigenous peoples, then you didn't need it to grant them special rights for their lands, which was the ultimate objective of governments. Now, we have come a long way from that, and indigenous dances are not prohibited anymore, but the negligent treatment that we're having from the current laws is still having a negative effect on dances. As I said before, they are not prohibited anymore, but they cannot be protected. So then the question is still there on what is the relationship, how fair is the relationship between these regimes, these legal regimes and dances. Please, Nai, help me with the next slide. This is the Ritmo Center that I was talking about. I went here for the summer of 2019 to practically engage with new technologies of human movement recognition, because in any dispute of misappropriation of a dance, decision makers and in courthouses, they will ask experts and external sources to assess and to address the level of similarity between the different dances, regardless of the kind of system that they are relying on in normative terms. And so I was wondering if this new technology could help us with quantitative insights about the degree of similarity that indigenous dances have between the quotes unquote original expression and the misappropriated version. So please, the next slide is going to show you some images of the way that I was engaging with this new technology. So some of these reports I discovered because of the wonderful work that it's been carried at this research center that you can find out on the internet. If you type University of Oslo Ritmo Center, you're going to find that there's a lot of freely available resources, as the musical gestures toolbox, which was designed and created by the director, Alexander Jensenius. And through that software, you can create some of these reports that you're seeing now on this slide. So quantity of motion reports, motion grams as the one on the bottom, 3D representations of dance or history of motion reports. And so I became interested in this, not because I thought that that they could work independently, but I was always keeping in the back of my mind how this can become either evidence in court or can strengthen the claims of misappropriation by indigenous populations also outside of court. And just to give you a little insight, the picture at the bottom, the black picture there, the motiongram, this is a representation of the whole Macarena dance. So if it's like the 50 seconds of the whole Macarena dance was condensed in a picture, all the pixels of the dance, of the recording of a person dancing the Macarena is condensed in this image. So you can see these little peaks and valleys. Those are the little hops that you have to take every time that you're turning to the other side of the room. It's just so that you can make sense of what these images can convey and what these images can do. Please, next slide. But in particular, I was working within this center and all these resources and all these tools. I was working, I became part of this project called the Movement Similarity Project. And I was working along with a PhD fellow, Benedict Wallace, under the supervision of Christian Imoen. And what we did was we wanted to know what was going to be the possibility of a computer-based system to assess the degree of similarity between two recordings of the same dance. And so we use a motion capture laboratory, and we ask 10 different subjects to perform the same dance over and over with different degrees of expressions or style, depending on how energetic, how fast, how slow, how sudden was, or how sustained was the movements. But basically we wanted to come up with this pool of recordings that afterwards we could start comparing to one another thanks to similarity algorithms that were created for the sake of this project. And so this is in the picture that you can see projected. These are two different subjects that were recorded, and on the right side you can see how the markers that we place on their body for the motion capture recording portray the data. And so if you compare to one another, this is one of the reports that you can get from such comparison. Please, next slide. And to summarize, we ask subjects to wear this motion capture technology suit, and then we process all these recordings through a quality system. And then once that we had all this pool of recordings, we started to compare and analyze them through these similarity algorithms. But the similarity algorithms were aimed to analyze the amount of acceleration, the cumulative distance traveled, the velocity, like different aspects that you can measure based on the recordings that you previously had. So this is just so that you can have an idea, a general overview of how this technology or how this project was working. Next slide, please. Of course, now we are speaking about new technologies and indigenous populations. And so the issue of accessibility needs to be highlighted, because the digital divide is very much real. And also we cannot overlook the fact that a lot of indigenous communities are still living in conditions of economic precarity. And so if this technology has any possibility to be applied in real life circumstances, I needed to understand the different levels or the different affordances of this technology. And I discovered that you can have very expensive software and very expensive equipment to do this kind of recordings and this kind of measurements, but you can also have very affordable technologies as the Kinect by Microsoft, or there are also a lot of codes available online by different projects funded by the European Union that are offering resources so that people can come up with their own apps or their own projects to start measuring, recording, and analyzing, as the musical gestures toolbox that I mentioned a moment ago, which is freely available on the official website of the Ritmo Center. Please, next slide. And so starting to come up with some conclusions on how this technology can help the indigenous peoples and indigenous claims of misappropriation, I needed to go back to my research question, which was, what is the role that this technology has to prevent or protect indigenous dances? And so I realized that indeed this technology can create quantitative reports of similarity that can assist indigenous claims in and out of court. I'm saying in and out of court because some dances, the biggest part, the majority of indigenous dances cannot be protected through intellectual property regimes, but derivatives of these dances can be. Because of this notion of innovation, new dances that are based or inspired by traditional dances can be protected. And so these quantitative reports, or this kind of fixation through motion capture technology, can assist the grant of ownership rights for indigenous populations. Of course, a lot of assimilation issues and commoditization concerns still need to be confronted and raised over and over again, but I found that there's an important possibility there. A very important possibility as well is the usage that you can have for this technology to prevent third parties from gaining ownership rights. And this is a key issue because there are accounts of choreographers and dancers that have been using other tools that intellectual property laws offer. And so the main element that it's used is copyright, and that is the most important resource that you can have. But dancers as Louis Fuller from the modern dance school, she decided to start having patents for the costumes or the elements, the technical resources that she was dancing, that she was using while dancing. And so to protect this, you need to apply for the protection of a patent. But in the decision makers, in order to give you such rights, will compare the item that you're trying to protect against all the other items that have been already protected. This is what's known the prior art. And for this sense, I realized that a strong digitization and documentation of indigenous dances can prevent and extinguish the pretension of third parties to gain new rights of ownership on or authorship over these dances. And it is important to highlight as well that because of the narrow notions of innovation, because of the requirement of fixation, there are interesting strategies that people can use to protect indigenous dances, even though I already said that the majority of these dances are not protected because they are considered not innovative enough. The fact that you are documenting or archiving or digitizing these practices might be seen from the perspective of the law as an innovation. And so you can be granted ownership rights over those dances if they have been digitized, if they have been collected and documented in digital repositories through motion capture techniques. So I figure this can be a very important resource for those dances that cannot be protected. And the next slide, which is actually my last slide, I'm just gonna raise some issues that I figured were relevant for me over this research. And so I want to clarify that dance is multimodal, and you cannot reduce dance just to these kinetic trajectories that I showed you when I was speaking about technology. You cannot reduce dance and say that these 3D markers in space, in a virtual space, that is all that dance is. I am addressing dance as a multimodal phenomenon, and in this same sense, misappropriation can also happen in a multimodal way. Some cases that are of the ones that I've been reviewing use the costume. Some other cases use myths. Some other cases use symbols. Some other cases use the patterns of movements. And for the sake of this research, I focus a little bit more in the patterns of movements, but this does not mean that there are not other ways in which these dances can be appropriated. Regarding the metrics that we use for the Movement Similarity Project, I wanted to say that these are not objective or independent per se. These are always changing, and these are always reacting to the settings and the input of the human researchers that are behind them. And so in this sense, I want to clarify this because I'm not aiming to say that this new technology can by itself assess these cases. What I'm saying is that this new technology of human movement recognition can help us to quantitatively see how similar they are. The digitization through motion capture technology can be more culturally sensitive, because I realize that a lot of indigenous populations have prohibitions of rendering their identity and having their faces photographed or represented in digital or virtual media. And so, as you saw in the slides that I showed you about new technology, movement is reduced to this 3D skeletons, which might be more culturally sensitive to the way that indigenous populations think about themselves and the way that they transmit their knowledge. These new technologies can enhance the process of transmission of corporeal practices. I find out about a lot of projects that are using motion capture, that are using these new technologies of human movement recognition to allow more people to learn these dances through digital environments or web-based environments. So in that sense, with the strong protocols of management of the data and making sure that all the data is labeled and shared according to indigenous parameters, this can be a very strong ally to strengthen the transmission of dances that are in danger at the moment. And so, of course, these connections between technology and indigenous dances is strongly challenging the essentialism that we have about indigenous peoples as communities that either resist or surrender to the future, but never really create their own future. And so I was thinking that nonprofits and academia and institutions, we need to start engaging, and we need to start allowing indigenous peoples to explore and to use and appropriate these tools so that they can register, protect, and safeguard their own dances. Finally, I wanted to raise attention to the fact that every revolution is in essence a technological revolution. And so I discovered over this research that the reason why the first dance that was able to be protected in the United States under copyright law was because the applicant attached a lavonotated score of the movements. And this is key because the decision makers for the first time were able to see and visualize the labor of dancers in such a way that they extended the protection that until that moment was only for other types of art. And you can also take the case of music, because recording technologies and recording devices changed the way that music authorship was created, and music recognition and ownership rights were granted under the law. Because of these technologies, applicants that wanted to protect their musical creations, not only that were forced to submit notation and notation scores of their own creations, but they also started to be forced to bring a recording of their creations, of their music. So what I'm thinking here is how these technological developments are changing the ways that we see culture, that are changing the ways that we see the labor of artists and dancers. And in this sense, I hope that some of this technology can challenge the narrow notions of innovation, of authorship, and fixation that until the moment they are still playing against the interest of indigenous peoples. Thank you so much, and that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jorge. It's a very interesting topic, and of course, it's something that is affecting people in many places. Please, all your questions are very welcome. So, in case you want to ask something to Jorge, you can raise your hands or either write it on the chat. So thank you, Juan Felipe. Go ahead, please, with your question.
Well, Jorge, first of all, thank you for such an incredible work and for a nice way of presenting it. I think that your way of thinking is sort of questioning, in a sense, the way things are done today. And I value your work. I think that that it is a necessary contribution to indigenous communities, or rather to traditional music and dance forms as well. Now, I am going to play a little bit of devil's advocate because I want to understand you better. And my question would be, like, we talk about protecting property, community property. And the question is, protecting from what? I know that you have talked about this before, like, for example, well, okay, so these football players come and they do some sort of traditional movements and they give no credit to the community. And I'm going to pose this question, and it seems absurd, but okay, they are losing money maybe. They should have received money because someone used something that was theirs. But is this about money? Is this about saying, this is mine? You mentioned a very important thing, is that one way of silencing communities is to sort of silence their dances or invisibilize them. Maybe it's about that, but maybe there are other things at play. So why is it so terrible that this sort of misappropriation in intangible cultural heritage happens? And just as a final complement to my question, I would say, in the case of our Peruvian environment, for example, Perú Negro was a very influential group. They developed lots of choreographies and they changed the way Afro-Peruvian dance was conceived. And this allowed also other groups to build on their work, sometimes reproducing parts of these choreographies, sometimes taking their elements or the logic behind it and implementing it. And this was actually positive, and this allowed the revival of the festejo and other dances to happen, right? So I'm curious about your reply.
Thank you so much, Juan. And I am very happy that you're raising this question because it's a very complex issue, and it's important to clarify that I'm not against cultural exchange and I'm not against about intertextuality, because even within indigenous communities, there's a lot of transaction of symbols, images, songs, myths. So I'm not advocating for the for freezing the practices. But we need to acknowledge that when we are speaking about these transactions of cultural products, there are power asymmetries that still need to be addressed and assessed. And so I was reading about the current situation that is happening with music and copyrights in music. And if you take this element, if you combine this situation with the element of technology, some of you might found out already that if you are uploading a song on YouTube that is recognized to have a fragment of a song that it's already protected by copyright, your video is going to be taken down immediately. And so I am not claiming that this is the right path. I don't expect within 10 or 15 years to have the same situation with dance, meaning to start having similarity algorithms all over Vimeo and YouTube that they can identify if you are dancing a dance that is not yours. I'm not saying that this is the right way to go. What I'm raising in this discussion is that in the current state of affairs, the people that are having the worst situation are indigenous populations, because they don't have the means to fix their dances according to the parameters that are set in place by intellectual property regimes, which are in fact upholding only Western perspectives about epistemology, about culture, and about the way that ownership and authorship happen. And so I think it's very fair that you are raising this question of what are we protecting indigenous communities against. And I think more than anything is the demoralizing effect that this is having among communities, because every time that one of these cases is happening, you're gonna see a lot of indigenous representatives manifesting themselves all over social media, all over the internet, saying how deeply affected that they are by these disrespectful uses. And besides this, I was wondering if the rest of the world is already commodifying their practices and gaining profits and money for their cultural creations, how come that the only people that are not able to do the same is the people that don't fix the dances, that they orally transmit their dances, they collectively own the dances? Because at the end of the day, what we're having here is not only a collusion of different laws, but we are having a contradiction of epistemologies, of a Western perspective, which is still inspired by this these romantic notions of authorship that rely on this eureka moment of individual people just coming up with creation, and therefore excluding all the other ways in which you can produce and sustain knowledge that are based on communities of practitioners and communities of knowledge. So I hope that in that sense I addressed your question, but if you think that there's any other element, we can keep discussing it.
Thank you very much, Jorge, for your answer. There's someone, Daliana wrote a question. I'm going to read it to you, and says, there are some theatrical techniques that are inspired in tribal or Asian cultures. So how can the arts in general, like dancing, take elements from these cultures to create something new, respecting them and not making a bad exploration and misappropriation of them? Is it something possible to do? Thank you, Daliana, for your question.
That is a wonderful question, and I do think that it's important to talk about this, because I don't want to overuse the notion of cultural appropriation. Now we are seeing a lot of cases, a lot of people taking on this label and raising some concern or some generalized sense of fear that you cannot use anything that does not belong to your culture. And I don't think that that is the case, and I don't think that that is the way to go. I do think that it's valuable and fruitful to inspire one another and to use elements from different cultures. But the key issue here is, how do you do that? What is the power asymmetries that are operating within these transactions? It is horizontal or is it vertical? Is it unidirectional or is it bidirectional? Because over this research, I was also considering, wow, there are so many claims of people saying that all the choreographers have either inspired or taken or copied elements from traditional cultures, how we can deal with this, how we can keep producing new creations in a respectful way. And then I was very happy to find out about the work of very interesting people such as Amanda Piña. She's a choreographer from Chile who's currently based in Austria. And she is doing a lot of indigenous inspired choreographies that are presented in the context of gallerias and contemporary art festivals. But the way in which she is doing it, it is very respectful in the sense that the same bearers of the traditions are present with her. So not only that she is there dancing with her dancers, but she's bringing the medicine men, she's bringing the dancers, she's bringing the shamans that hold these practices so that they can see how their traditions are being translated to different contexts and also materially benefiting from the outcomes of such presentations. Because in festivals, in gallerias, of course, besides the aesthetical and the artistical exchange, there's also an economic exchange that is happening and that indigenous peoples are largely excluded from. And so summarizing this issue even more, I can say that we can do a small test every time to assess if there was a misappropriation or not. Was there a previous consultation? Was there an agreement? Was there a sustained consent for this practice? Because in this sense, we're gonna start moving on to more respectful practices of cultural exchange and cultural inspiration. So thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Jorge, again for your answer. Beatrice, go ahead, please, with your question.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for connecting.
Thank you, Jorge. I was listening to you, and as I listened to your presentation, I couldn't stop the question when you mentioned property rights ownership. I couldn't stop myself thinking of owned by whom, you know, and thinking on the this romanticized view on communities and even communities of practitioners as completely, you know, homogeneous and horizontal and as a single entity. And and I wondered if you had like explored this, you know, even the asymmetries that happen inside the communities themselves. Like, is it really like, because we're talking on social practices, and we're talking that if you have a community, a dance might be completely different if it's done by different people, if it's done by kids, if it's done by the elders. So, and depends in each situation. So I was wondering if you have explored this like ambivalences that happen within the notion of community of practitioners. And also you just let me imagine kind of what the notions of law from indigenous point of view, that it's not exactly the same as you were saying before, the epistemological concerns on which the Western law is developed from, but rather how then maybe there are also indigenous notions that would help us, you know, construct other concepts for law and for protection. Thanks.
Thank you. This is another very important issue that I started coming across at the very end of my research. So I think it's important to realize that some indigenous communities are already profiting from their practices, and some indigenous communities are benefiting from the tourism industry and sustaining their livelihoods by selling their practices, either dances, songs, or any other cultural practice. So I do agree with you that we cannot fall in this second layer of essentialism by considering that every community, every indigenous community across the globe are working in a collective way, and that there's this complete horizontality, and there are not power asymmetries within communities, because that is not the case. And even when it comes to, I think you're right on that, and I think we need to challenge this perception, because this might be one of the reasons why the digital divide is still in place, and the reason why indigenous communities are not granted the possibility to start playing with these technologies and these possibilities, because under this romantic gaze towards indigenous populations, they are still these savage people that are living in this natural environment, that are dancing for no other purpose than spiritual considerations. And even though that might be the case for some communities, there are a lot of other communities that are conducting their practices in different ways that include commoditization. So I think that what I have been trying to come across with my topic is just that the conditions in which the commoditization of those practices might or might not happen need to be fair. And at the moment, those conditions are only privileging one particular way of creating dances, and not the ones that coincide with indigenous epistemologies. And finally, I wanted to say that the reason why I also thought that this technology could be culturally sensitive is because the identity of the practitioners is not shown. And even though the detail that you can get from motion capture recordings, it is very high, you cannot know who's the person that is dancing in a particular recording. So this can help to protect, document, and digitize practices without creating new hierarchies within communities, because it has happened in the past, for example, in the experience of East European countries that have a very strong documenting practices, that because of there are 1 or 2 or 3 dances that are repeatedly being shown in the videos that are archived in the museums, there are new perceptions or who is it that actually owns that dance. And so within communities, there might be this new delimitation of authorship, of ownership, and at the end of the day, power asymmetries, that I thought if we start using this technology that is not portraying identity, we could have a big chance to have strong documentation strategies, but without delimiting new authorship, new perceptions of authorship, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much, Jorge. I think that Richard might have a question.
Thank you. Please, Richard, go ahead and unmute yourself. And thank you so much for your question.
Sorry. Thank you for the presentation, Jorge. You've partly answered what I was thinking about, but I was also quite interested. I guess it ties in with Beatrice's thought on your own on ownership and authorship, because I was thinking about the picture from Fortnite, that squat kick. And as a traditional or indigenous movement, but I've encountered that in folk dances in Norway, in Russia, and in our own bongo in Trinidad. How do we then, who owns that? Who owns those similar movements in possibly 3 or 4 or 5 different cultures? You know, and as I saw that movement, I thought, yes, and I've also, I've encountered folk dances that are with similar movements in the 3 different places I've lived, or 4 different places I've lived. You know, how do we then, that also brings up another question of ownership and authorship, and how indigenous dances have grown in different countries that possibly have the same movement. You know, I just thought that was interesting. As I saw that, I thought, oh my gosh, you know, that's, yeah, another way of, and I guess plays into your multimodality of dance and creation as well. That's another way of looking, yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate these questions, because I feel like some of the issues that I was not able to explain over my presentation, now you're giving me the chance to elaborate a little bit more on those. And so by any means, I want to state that same steps equals same dance. There are a lot of different dancing cultures that involve similar patterns and similar steps that respond to the natural use of the human body and the possibilities that you have of the body in a rhythmic situation. And so in that sense, I think this is the reason why I was saying that there has to be a complementarity when you are assessing the similarity of dances. And this is precisely why I was saying that the computer-based system cannot fully address the similarity of two dances. Because if you only rely on that, you are gonna find that a lot of dances might be identified as the same because of the, as you're saying, because of the same steps or the same movements. But rather than only trusting in computer-based systems, we need to rely on them partially, but also listen to ethnographic and also qualitative and also expert takes and perspectives on what it is that every dance means. Because as you know, according to the particular dance tradition, only the hands take relevance, or maybe the arms are more valued, or in some cultures is the torso, is the verticality or the way that you're upholding your torso what really matters, or maybe your eyes. And in some other cultures, those aspects won't be even taken into consideration. And so if you are measuring only through computer-based systems, you are gonna have a strong degree of similarity. But this is why I'm saying that there has to be a complementarity between quantitative and qualitative assessments of similarity, so that we can move beyond what you're mentioning right now, this concern of thinking, oh my God, all these dances look the same. Have they been copying each other? Or are all these cases of misappropriation of dance because they seem to have basic steps that are present among all of them? So I think in this sense, a limitation that we found in the experiment that I talked about the movement similarity project was that the system itself cannot operate autonomously. And so at the moment we figured that was a limitation, because we still needed to say, we still needed to express, and we still needed to clarify what were the qualities that we wanted the computer to focus on. But now that I'm thinking again, I think this is a strength, because there is no way that a computer-based system will be universally valid, and there's no way that a computer-based system can assess different dances cross-culturally. So this limitation that we found, I think it's more of a strength right now, in the sense of like keep complementing these algorithms, these systems with human perspectives of practitioners. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for your question and also for your answer, Jorge. There is a comment wrote it by Michel Feder-Nadov. Says, thank you. It seems there might be parallel between the extraordinary and the ordinary discussion earlier by Joe, and the division between the formal and informal knowledge and skills. And building on that, I would also like to ask you, Jorge, how you are thinking, how are you thinking about the dynamics in body movement, especially regarding dance, which are, at least in my experience, I noted that they are not fixed. They change. Dance is something that can constantly incorporate new elements, exclude others. This in the scenario of indigenous communities dancing. So how you deal with that? How are you thinking in how these new technologies? Because I feel that in a way they might fix, something that is its very nature is to be dynamic as well.
Absolutely, I agree very much with you, and thanks for the question. I think there's a big risk of reification and freezing the practices, not only through computer-based systems, but even from previous systems that I mentioned. For example, the UNESCO institution, which is coming across with intangible cultural heritage frameworks, and wherein you can find the list of practices that are safeguarded. And I do think that there's this big risk of essentializing or crystallizing or freezing practices. But something that I found very interesting in this research is that I came across projects such as iTreasures. This was a project funded by the European Union, which is using and involving new technologies of human movement recognition and also motion capture. And the interesting fact is that not only that you were able to have a documented version of the dance, but also users of this platform were able to input their own version of the dance. And so in this sense, variations are incorporated, and different styles in which you can incorporate, in which you can perform a dance, might get clustered under the same category, which is interesting because I figured not only the products themselves need to be protected, but also the processes and the practices behind them. And I think that there's a big opportunity to use some of these technologies to allow the practices to keep growing and to keep adding on, especially for the systems that are involving this active input, or that are allowing users to come with their own versions or their own performances of dance, so that you at the end you have, instead of like a one right way to do it, you end up with this kind of constellations around every dance practice, so that you can acknowledge that there are a lot of different ways in which you can perform the same dance, and the varying degrees of performing might respond to the performers themselves, the way that they have been taught, the way that they have been training before. And so I do agree with that, in that we need to keep raising this question of how not to reify. But as I said before, I think this technology can offer some good possibilities for that.
Thank you very much, Jorge. We are approaching the end of this first webinar. So if anyone would like to ask a question, it is now the moment. So for all of you, tomorrow and the following days, we are going to have more of this webinar series. Almost every day we will have anthropologists and dancer or performers. So please feel free to join and to share this information with people that you might think that they have an interest. We really appreciate your participation here. Thank you very much, all of you. Hope that you have enjoyed this session, and wish you all the best.